Of course, there are lots of books that historians have written about national political crises, so what on earth can Jared Diamond bring new to this subject? Well, I'm interested in political crises from the perspective of the personal crises that all of us have to deal with as individuals. Every one of you here, I'm sure, has been through a crisis resulting from, you know the causes. The breakup or the threatened breakup of a marriage or another relationship. The death of a loved one that makes you doubt that the world is a just place. Or a serious setback to your health or your career or financial security. All of those types of crises that we've all been through. We either confront them or we avoid confronting them, but they all raise the question, what did I do wrong? How did I get into this mess? What do I now have to change about myself so as not to get into such a mess again? And what about myself is okay and doesn't need changing? Naturally, I'm interested in personal crises as a result of my having had to deal with my own share of them, but also because my wife, Marie, is a clinical psychologist who during the first year of our marriage was doing a year-long training in the clinical specialty of crisis therapy. That's a branch of psychotherapy that instead of spending years in which you can at leisure explore your early childhood and what that means for you today. In crisis therapy, someone comes in with an acute crisis, they got to be helped fast because there's the risk that the client may try to commit suicide. Although most of us get through our crises, we figure out what we do need to change about ourselves. But because in crisis therapy you have to figure out how the patient is dealing with it, every week Marie and her fellow therapists gathered together on Friday. They discussed how all the clients in the clinic were doing, who was doing well, and what were the outcome predictors. What factors make it likely that a person will succeed in dealing with a crisis and what suggests that they're not going to deal with a crisis. And as Marie over dinner told me about these outcome predictors, it dawned on me that similar outcome predictors, or at least factors for which these outcome predictors of personal crises can serve as a metaphor, similar predictors or related predictors also apply to the outcomes of national crises. You can, I'm sure, think of this from your own experience. Just think of the crises that you've been through or that you've seen other people going through. You know that the first step in dealing with a crisis is to acknowledge that you're in a crisis. If you don't acknowledge that you're in a crisis, you're going to get nowhere in dealing with it. And similarly, nations have to begin by acknowledging that there's a crisis instead of denial. You also know from experience that the next thing you have to do is to accept responsibility for doing something. If you assume the mantle of victim and get wrapped up in self-pity and blaming others, if you blame it on others and don't accept responsibility that there's something you have to do, whatever those bad people out there are, if you don't accept responsibility, you won't make any progress dealing with a crisis. And similarly, nations cannot fall into the mantle of victimhood. Consider the difference between Germany after World War II and Germany after World War I. After World War I, Germany denied responsibility for the mess that it had gotten into, got wrapped up in self-pity, and the result was the disasters of 1930 and World War II. Whereas since World War II, Germany has been pitiless, eventually, in accepting responsibility for what they did in the war. You know from personal experience that another consideration in dealing with a crisis is what psychotherapists call building a fence. In a crisis, at first you may feel that everything in your life has gotten messed up, and as long as you feel that way, you're overwhelmed and you can't make any progress towards solving the crisis. So again, an early step is to build a fence, to recognize inside the fence there's the problem that has to be dealt with, and outside the fence everything is okay. So you recognize that what you need is selective change rather than massively throwing away everything about yourself, which is impossible. I'm sure all of you know from experience the importance of help from others and looking to others as models. Often when we're plunged into a crisis, on the first day after the breakup of my first marriage, I went out and talked to friends, 4 or 5 close friends, who'd either been through marital breakups or had risked marital breakups. and the emotional support makes a big difference, you know, in getting through a crisis. But also from friends, you can learn models for how they have dealt with a similar situation, and that may help you figuring out how to deal with your own crisis. But nations also, they may get help from other nations, from allies, or they may refuse to get help. Nations may use other nations as models for how to solve a problem, or as we'll see, they may refuse to use other nations as models. You know from your own experience that honest self-appraisal is essential for getting through a crisis. If you're not honest with yourself, you're not going to resolve the problem. And nations also can be either honest or not honest in dealing with problems. And you also know from experience the importance of confidence from dealing with previous crises. If you've dealt with crises before and gotten through them, then when you come to a new crisis, you have the confidence that I got through messes before, I will probably get through this mess, even though at the moment I'm not sure how I'll do it. And that's why personal crises are so devastating for teenagers and young adults for whom it may be their first serious crisis. And similarly, nations gain strength from crises that they've been through before. Britain, for a long time after World War II, gained strength thinking back to the Battle of Britain of 1940. We beat the Luftwaffe, we did that so we can do anything. And similarly, Finland, having gotten through its war against the Soviet Union, we survived the Soviet Union, the attack by the Soviet Union. No matter what crisis we face today, it can't be as bad as the Winter War.